Welcome to CDDRL and Novoe Vremya series of interview brilliant minds of Stanford and Silicon Valley. We are very happy to have you today with us to talk about cybersecurity, safety of the internet, and recent trends of the security in the internet that we have.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
First, to start with, what is your view on current state of the cybersecurity in the world?
Well, when I was in college, one of the pieces of advice I got was that security is a great career path because it's the only part of technology that gets worse every year. And that hasn't changed. Unfortunately, one of the things we find is that the overall cybersecurity and the vulnerability of societies to attack is inversely proportional to how much technology is part of people's lives and how complex that technology is. So as long as those trends keep on going in the same direction, where more people come online, that more of their day is spent on technology, and that technology is more and more difficult to understand, we're going to end up with societies continuing to be more vulnerable to attack and manipulation.
What are the biggest challenges and threats you see now, like at the current moment?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the biggest issues we have in security overall is our industry is starting to understand what things you need to do to protect a reasonably sized company or institution, but we don't have the people to implement it. And that's one of the biggest issues we have, especially in the corporate sector, is that the need and the threat profile vastly outstrip the supply of talent. And that is true globally in developed Western economies, but especially in the developing world, that companies that are critical to people's lives, technologies critical to people's lives, that there's just not enough people to protect it. And that's a problem that we're not making the right headway on.
Yeah, actually you're making here a great point in terms of, even if the big companies are investing a lot in cybersecurity, we still have small and mid-sized business, especially small and small businesses that are not investing, they just don't have resources.
Right. Yeah, so here in the United States, we have what's called the Fortune 500, right? We have the 500 largest public companies by revenue or market cap. And of those companies, if you look at them, maybe 150 of them are doing an okay job on security, right? So this is the big banks, oil and gas companies, defense industrial base, some insurance companies, the big tech companies. These are companies that understand the need for security, have the money and resources to put behind it, and have backing from their executives. The rest of the Fortune 500, and pretty much all of the next several thousand companies just in the United States, are in real trouble. Those are companies that if they faced a truly dedicated adversary, they would probably find that all of their security precautions that they had invested in were not adequate. And the other issue we have is, as an industry, we focus on those top 100 companies. So it's kind of become a little bit of a joke that if you start a new security startup, that you try to get a Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase to be your first test customer, that gives you cred that you have a valid product. But the problem is that those companies are not indicative of the needs of the vast majority of the economy globally. And so as the security industry continues to fight for the budgets of the top 100 companies, there's very little focus on what to do for everybody else.
Yeah, and then we had an examples of attacks on Ukraine, where attack started from a very small business in Ukraine, and it spread it out globally. And we had a shutdown of one of the biggest freight forwarding companies in the world.
Yes. I mean, and that's a fascinating example of, the NotPetya attack that you're talking about started with MEDoc in Ukraine and then affected all of these other institutions. Basically, everybody who had to pay taxes in Ukraine, which is most global companies, had some machine that was vulnerable to this. And so that is a great point. And it also demonstrates one of the things that has happened over the last couple of years, was it used to be that only companies that were directly involved in geopolitics would be attacked by a professional actor, like say a Russian military, hacking team. So if you were building a fighter jet in Germany or the United States, you knew that was your threat profile. But in the case of NotPetya, you've got shipping companies like Maersk, who never thought that they would be attacked at this level, becoming collateral damage in these campaigns. And so I think one of the things we need to learn is that just because your company seems simple just because it seems that what you do is not super critical to national security doesn't mean you're going to face adversaries at that level. Another great recent example is Marriott, which there's been a recent indictment of Chinese nationals who broke in and stole lots of information on 500 million travelers to the Marriott hotels worldwide. And it looks like that was, the incentive for that was for the Chinese to gather up huge amounts of information to power their intelligence services. Again, if you worked for a hotel chain, you weren't expecting that the Ministry of State Security or the People's Liberation Army, that's the kind of threat profile you're facing.
So like every day new challenge, both for the global businesses, small businesses, and individuals.
Yes.
Any positive prognoses, whether we can, when or whether, or if we will overcome it?
So there's actually a couple of good trends that I think we can grow on. The first is the growth of cloud computing. So it used to be 20 years ago, if you wanted to run a full-fledged business, you had to run all your own IT. You had no other choices. Now you can start a company and write almost no code yourself to rely only on products that are provided by other people. And that is a critical thing. The truth is, at this level of threat, if you're somebody like a Marriott or a Maersk, you're not able to run your own infrastructure securely, especially with software that you don't control. And so moving to cloud computing is a great option for existing enterprises and new enterprises to push back a little bit and to concentrate the staff and the capabilities they have on the parts of their business that make them special. And then the second good trend is in the consumer space, the move to mobile devices has reduced the possibility of certain kinds of attacks. So mobile devices are generally running off of limited app stores. They have a number of security features built in that reduce the ability for arbitrary code to execute. And so compared to the PC era, when everybody was logged into their PC as a local admin and could install whatever software they wanted, the mobile future is more secure. So I think those are positive trends. They're just not trending quickly enough to help us deal with all these issues.
So are you more positive or negative?
Well, professionally, I'm negative, right? Like I'm a professional pessimist. That's what I get paid to do. Like my entire career has been looking for the downside, unfortunately. So I'm not a good person to ask that.
Yeah, but still we have a positive trends.
Well, we have to look at the positive here too. The truth is that technological advancement has also lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It has brought the world closer in many ways. Like there are all kinds of benefits to this technology. So you're right, we shouldn't just look at the downside. But we do find ourselves in the situation where we build really complex technologies deeper and deeper into our lives without being prepared for the implications of what that means.
Let's talk about other aspect of actually security in the internet, which is tech companies, especially social media, they play more important role in democracy. Their power is increasing. We see that they play important role in elections.
Yeah.
We see that some actors are trying to influence elections results or election choice by social media. What is your vision on that? What are the roles of social media in democracy right now?
A number of commentators have remarked that the explosion of social media is probably the biggest change in the ability for individuals to get their voices heard since the creation of the printing press, right? Since the kind of monopoly of the Catholic Church on the written word was broken. And I think that's true. When the printing press was invented, it generated hundreds of years of war in Europe, right? And I think there's a natural amount of societal dislocation that we're just going to have to navigate ourselves through and hopefully handle it in a better way than other information revolutions have been handled. When it comes to social media, I think we have to be careful about what we ask them to fix. So if you look at any of these social media companies, they have parts of their product that allow small groups of people to talk to one another. They have parts where somebody can say things at a group of friends and family, a slightly larger circle. And then there are parts that allow them to speak to millions. And it's on the situations and the parts of the product that give people lots of amplification that I think there's more responsibility. But we have to be careful not to blur that responsibility with also the rights of individuals to both have speech themselves, but also importantly, and something that's forgotten a lot, is for people to be able to choose what information they consume, right? And I think we have to make sure that we ask for responsible amplification without also empowering these companies to control the entire political debate within countries around the world. Because in the end, 3 or 4 all-American companies, all of which are $500 billion to $1 trillion in value, with no democratic accountability, they're the ones making these decisions. And while they have the legal right to make the decisions, we have to be careful what kind of norms we want and what kind of internal processes we want them to create, that when they do so, that they are making decisions that are not judgment calls on whether or not something is valid political speech, but much more data-driven decisions on whether or not people are being misleading, whether they're using inappropriate means of creating amplification, whether they are doing things that actually affect the safety of individuals.
Yeah, so we actually are already facing this dilemma, how actually to let people speak freely and to express themselves in social media. That was the major purpose why the social media were created, to let people, tell what they want. But from the other side, not to use it as a means of influencing, large group of people and just trying to change the way they think.
Well, to be fair though, all democracy is an exercise in influencing people and changing the way they think, right? So I think it's less about stopping the ability to influence and more about choosing who gets to have that influence and what kind of transparency do you give individuals. And so I think, obviously foreign influence is a difficult issue. Yes. It's also in some cases difficult to define. We just went through the European elections and there's been a lot of controversy because Facebook created new rules around European elections that made it very difficult for political parties to advertise across multiple countries, even though they had candidates in multiple countries. Because some of the ideas Facebook was using, that an election is tied to a nation, not a pan-national election. So we can deal with those corner cases, but creating rules that give people transparency who speakers are, and then control the access to amplification technologies like advertising for foreign groups, I think is the reasonable start. You can do that then without deciding who are reasonable speakers within a country. But that's where we're moving towards. And that's, I think, a really dangerous place to go. Because as much as we argue about this in the United States, 90-some% of Facebook's users are not American. And a lot of them live in democracies even, where the government had no compunction of using Facebook's rules against any kind of minority parties. And I think we just gotta be very careful about asking companies to police what is the window of acceptable political discourse outside of really specific rules on hate speech, calls to violence, and the like.
I think you made just a great point, because the revolution of dignity in Ukraine actually started from the post in Facebook made by my friend and People's Deputy now, Mustafa Nayem, that actually called people to come to the streets. And if, for example, we had this control of the content in the internet, or in Facebook, maybe that this post would never been actually there for quite some time.
It's kind of crazy. I mean, there's well-meaning people in the US and Western Europe who are asking for control of speech that sounds a lot like the ruling government in Ukraine at the time, or the Egyptian government in 2011, right? Like, we've got to be real careful of building mechanisms that then governments can put their hands on those levers of power.
Yeah, but the question is how we deal with dilemma that recently we had with this Nancy Pelosi video on Facebook, where they actually, put it on this special rewind mode when she doesn't look very good in, but then Facebook refused to delete it.
Yes.
So that's again a dilemma. What is your view? How we deal with that?
So I think that's a great example of a situation in which we want Facebook to act to reduce spread without deleting. First off, there's a huge amount of satire and parody and edited videos that are meant to make fun of politicians. And things that are not allowed to be done against normal citizens in Western democracies, especially the United States, are often given special protections when they're about politicians, right? Politicians have very little rights in the United States under libel defamation laws to try to stop that kind of speech. We give people a lot of leeway for it. And I think the social media companies need to reflect the same kind of calculation, which is that for core political speech about elected officials, that you're very small c conservative, very careful about making decisions that police other people's speech. In this case, they're something that has technical indications of being modified in a way like that, I think you should label publicly, and then that label should reduce a certain kind of amplification. It should never be allowed on advertising. There's really no free speech rights on the advertising platform if you're paying for the speech. I think that greatly reduces the possibility. But I don't think they should delete it, because I think you could imagine what the world is if they just deleted the Pelosi video. Is what you would end up is millions and millions of people uploading it in protest. And they would have to deploy machine learning that looks for any video that looks like Nancy Pelosi that's slightly edited and delete all of it, right? And it would create a huge firestorm and way more attention on the disinformation than what we have right now. In fact, I expect most of the views on the Pelosi video are driven from the media coverage of the video itself, right? And so that's the other thing we need to get past, is that the media, when they see something they don't like on social media, they need to stop telling people that they saw that and telling people, this is so dangerous, you're not allowed to see it, right? That is the message that a number of people are getting, is that there's something online that I don't like and you should not be allowed to see it. That drives engagement, right? And so that kind of allowing these people that make this disinformation to control our conversation is one of the powers they have. And we've got to stop letting people, like in this case, part of it was Fox News, control the entire conversation with a little bit of outrage.
Let's talk about this Russian disinformation and foreign players in social media. I really like the point that you made about actually not allowing foreign players to intervene into the national politics.
Right.
But usually, they are also kind of a smart people. Sometimes, quite often, they work through local groups.
Yes.
How would you control that?
Well, I don't think social media can control that. I think that is going to be one of the ways that a variety of governments try to bypass the restrictions, is that they're going to back local groups with money and perhaps content. And I don't think that is placed for the companies. I don't think that it's realistic to think that they can investigate speakers who are legitimately can prove their citizenship within a country of who they're being influenced by. That's going to require a relationship between the companies and the government. That's also why I think the companies need to have great transparency mechanisms, so that if you're a journalist, if you're a government researcher, if you're law enforcement, you have the ability to go and see who's running ads, who's behind certain pages, and then tie that into investigations in those countries. But to put that on the tech companies, I think is just unrealistic.
Okay. But how political manipulation works now in Facebook? How it works? Like, it starts from the post, it engages advertising, it engages bots. How it works now?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different models. Mostly it's not bots, it's humans. And it's human beings creating groups that are driving a specific highly divisive message and then trying to gather up people to join those groups or to follow pages. And they can gather those people either using advertising or by spamming their message out to other groups that might have the same kind of political affinities. The other mechanism is to use actual offensive cyber techniques to gather up information and then to leak it, right? So in the US, this was famous with the GRU hack and leak campaign. And so in those situations, you might create a social media presence to lie about who you are and to try to release that information in a way that with fewer of your fingerprints on it. But for the most part, that attack is actually targeted against kind of the regular media and the general conversation about candidates.
So are we ready to fight that now, or we still are in the process of developing, the ways how to actually identify this?
Well, I don't think the fight will ever be done, right? Like, the truth is in a free society, people can inject ideas, right? And that this is one of the weaknesses of living in a free society, is that other people who you don't like have a voice. I think we're just going to have to live with it, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that sometimes people put too much pressure on social media as compared even to printed media in terms of this burden of, what is disinformation, what is right, what is wrong.
Well, I don't think the company should be deciding what's right and what's wrong. I think they need to decide who is allowed to have voice and to enforce those rules, right? And it would be great to see the changes that have happened in companies like Google and Facebook have been completely voluntary and have been made without any kind of democratic guidance. So I would like to see democratic states follow up with their own rules around who are allowed to advertise, who's allowed to be part of the discourse in national elections. I think the enforcement of who you are is important. I think the transparency about who is behind certain groups is going to be important. That's something that the companies still need to work on. It's just a real challenge because in places like Turkey or Egypt or Thailand, the anonymity that these companies provide is actually a critical part of having any kind of democratic discourse. So, but this is a situation where you might enforce different rules in a country with free speech laws versus a country like Turkey.
Yeah, that's a big threat, authoritarian regime and social media. Actually, we see that in those countries that you mentioned, in some others, social media are the only way for people to express themselves, actually, and to have published their different opinion that the current government or the current regime has.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's especially important as we see, we see a number of countries that have democratically elected leaders that are moving towards autocracy. The Philippines is a great example of a leader who was legitimately elected, but now that he's in power, he is trying to use the movement behind him to silence voices against himself and to use the power of the state to silence people on social media. And so we got to be really careful to build norms and procedures in speech protecting democracies that can't be abused in those democracies that are trending autocratic.
You mentioned that there should be national rules on this potential disinformation or players in social media. Do you believe in international rules for that? Or we are too far away from that point?
I think the path forward here is to get several democracies to create rules that are synchronized in their goals, if not in the exact letter of the law. And then that would help to start to establish international norms that could be followed voluntarily by the companies worldwide. So we have a report coming out from our new group at Stanford about what we think the United States should do to protect its election. In that report, we have suggestions of the kinds of regulation we would like to see of ads, of social media posts, of foreign media in the United States. And while our recommendations are for the US Congress specifically, our goal is for the US to set a standard here that gets followed globally.
We've seen recently also Canada had this initiative of creating rules for social media. So I think that this could be aligned, or do you think they would have some different approach?
There's a number of countries doing this. The Canadians are looking into it. There hasn't been anything specific from them. The United Kingdom has published a white paper called the Online Harms White Paper, which I actually think was not very good. It's strange to say this. I think the French actually have the best approach that I've seen so far. So the French government embedded some of their people in Facebook to see what content moderation is like, and they have come up with a international framework that multiple democracies could participate in that would build guidelines that the companies would follow and interpret themselves without having to make the decisions on a case-by-case basis, and with some kind of synchronization across multiple countries. So I think the French model, there's a lot of details to be worked on, but I do think there is a model for international governance here that excludes those autocratic states from trying to manipulate the system to their benefit.
Yeah, well, are we far away from this international standards? Or how long it would take? What is your vision on that to get there?
We're years away, right? But we have to. If you're years away, you start now.
Yeah. And do you believe more in guidelines, or you believe more in set norms was potentially punishment for violation?
I mean, one of the weird things is when we talk about this stuff on social media, almost all the speech we're talking about is legal within the countries where it's happening, right? So all of the major US tech companies will honor an order from a democratic court system to take content down. What we're arguing about is what should the companies do on top of what is required by law. And so I do think no matter what we do, it is by definition going to be some kind of self-regulatory environment. The question is what kind of input do sovereign states, do NGOs, do civil society have into that? And that's something the companies have really failed to do so far, is they have failed to bring in other groups to get their input and to have a multi-stakeholder process where a number of people feel like they're heard. You can't make everybody happy, right? The truth is you can't make any speech decision that makes every party happy. But what you can do is have a broad set of people who get to contribute. So even if the decision isn't completely go their way, they understand that they had a meaningful say in how they got there.
Yeah, I think that this engaging as many different stakeholders and players into the decision-making process will make it more transparent, But what about setting up certain criteria, for defining, like whether this things should be there or
Right.
the things should go away?
I mean, I think governments are best positioned to start on that issue on the kinds of problematic speech that are already close to what they outlaw, right? And I think for the most part, calls to violence and kind of extreme hate speech, those are the places where these countries already have laws that perhaps have not been interpreted in a way that catches what's actually going on online. And so I think that's where they can start with that, with while still avoiding, generally if it's a call for violence and you're looking to stop the kinds of issues you see around like the Christchurch shooting, you can make rules around that kind of content without touching core political speech.
Now we have kind of a new trend. We have artificial intelligence penetrating different spheres of our life, including the security and social media.
Yeah.
Do you believe that artificial intelligence will influence somehow the security, will help us to actually fight the issues that we've just discussed or solve them?
Overall, I think machine learning is massively oversold as both a good and a harm, right? Too many people think that it's the end of the world, and too many people think it's a fantastic solution. And if you've ever had to have a team that deploys machine learning to do something practical, you'll find that we have technology that is very powerful but very dumb and fragile. And so it's very difficult to build machine learning algorithms that don't fail completely when the underlying issue changes just a little bit. And so I think machine learning is going to continue to be important on a number of safety issues. It's a core technology that allows thousands of people to understand and moderate the speech of billions of people. But in the, we just got to be careful to not oversell what you can do with ML. And I think a lot of the discussion of the bad uses of machine learning are a little bit overblown too. So for example, everybody likes to talk about deepfakes. Yeah. But what we see over and over again is that you can come up with a video that is not faked, that you edit a slight bit, that you do an excerpt, and the exact same video in two circumstances can be seen as supporting two totally different arguments, right? And so I think we overstate, it's fun to think about completely synthetic videos with politicians saying things that they've never said. I'm less worried about that than other kinds of much more subtle forms of manipulation that aren't as easy to prove that they're fake. Yeah,
I think that a lot of people believe that artificial intelligence will save us in all the spheres, but they still forget that the people are setting up criteria for actually machine learning to look the video through, they are actually providing the data for machine learning to be based on their choices upon, and we still have a lot of bias in this data.
Right, I mean, machine learning algorithms reflect the bias of data sets. That's not my area so much.
Okay, let's talk more about the recent comments that we have and trends in media, in printed media, or also in politics about Facebook. A lot of people say that Facebook is too powerful, that there should be some action to do something with the Facebook, including the potentially dissolving the company or doing some other things with the corporate structure. And we've seen the recent response of Mark Zuckerberg presenting his vision of the company developments. Mm-hmm. What is your state of play on that? Is Facebook too powerful?
A lot of people discuss antitrust because I think it's a simple solution to pivot to if you don't like a company. Whether Facebook is one company or three, these fundamental issues are the same, right? And so I think you can make an argument that the company is too powerful from a competition perspective, because you have the situation where Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they have so much money, and all those companies have so much insight into where technology is going. It's very easy for them to find potential competitors, take them off the stage, and then to lock out all of the other competitors in that space. And so I think there's good antitrust arguments, but those arguments should be based upon the competition side. All of these other issues people bring in are not made, for the most part, better or worse by any kind of antitrust action.
Yeah, so it's more about antitrust. You don't believe that it will contribute somehow in terms of solving the issue of disinformation, or more kind of fighting the political manipulation?
So one of the real problems of the discussion right now is everybody focuses on disinformation at Google's YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Part of that is because those three companies have teams who are looking for disinformation and reporting it, right? So we have a massive data sampling problem where the 1,000 other companies that have politically relevant user-generated content, none of them get talked about because none of them are finding it and publishing it. Effectively, everything you read in the Mueller report about Russian activity on Facebook came from Facebook. It came from my team. We found that and we turned it over. And so I think that's one of the problems here is that the big companies have the capability to build teams of folks mostly who come from the government who can find and stop this kind of stuff. And that distorts the entire conversation, that the idea that only the big companies have it. And so if you broke them up, you would still have the problem, right? And so if you're going to decide to do a breakup, if you're going to break up Facebook and Instagram, if you're going to break up YouTube and Google, it should be to create more competition. But don't imagine that all of a sudden the fake news problem or the disinformation problem goes away. The exact same speech problems, which is who gets to decide what is appropriate speech and who gets to decide who are appropriate speakers, that problem still exists no matter how many companies you have.
Yeah, in former Soviet Union countries, we had this saying like, you will be punished if you volunteer. So we have something like that here. All these companies just voluntarily provided information, disclosed information that they have, in their research team, and they are now seen as the evils, rather than the companies that are trying to do something.
Yeah, it's still, I think the biggest companies do have the responsibility to be the most transparent. Yeah. They have the responsibility, if they have the ability to find this stuff. It just means we can't distort our policy responses based upon kind of the even sampling of information across multiple different platforms.
Recently, in one of your interviews, you told that Facebook is like Game of Thrones at the highest level of leadership.
Yeah.
Does this influence policies that Facebook has in terms of disinformation, political manipulation? And like how quick is the response of Facebook to the threat that we are facing?
I think one of the things you see external to the company is that these decisions go back and forth. And so what you're seeing there is actually different factions inside the company winning or losing at every moment, right? And so I do think the internal political issues are heightened by the external scrutiny, and it makes it more difficult to respond in kind of a unified way if lots of people are fighting over who gets to make that decision. As for speed, the company is reacting now. I think part of the problem is there's so many different issues happening at once that we're not sure as a society what we actually want to focus on, right? And so whatever investment any of these companies make, those have to be 3, 6 month, 9 month, 1 year investments. And the kind of controversies ping pong back and forth between all of these different kinds of issues. And so that sometimes means it's hard for the companies to respond because they've put a huge amount of people maybe on disinformation, and then hate speech becomes a big deal. And so they move over to hate speech, and all of a sudden it becomes inauthentic content. And no matter how many resources you have to decide what to put them on. And so I do think that is an issue. The companies are going to have to resist the tendency to follow the ball of where the media conversation is going and focus on some of the kind of the core authenticity and integrity issues that a longer term focus on the core issues is going to be beneficial to them.
Now let's come back to more kind of issues that would be close to all the people that will be watching this interview. You are the father of 3. We all talk about kids' security in internet. What would be your advice to parents, like how to actually secure their kids in this era of misinformation, disinformation, manipulation, violence, hate speech?
Yeah, I see way too many parents just giving their kids phones and not supervising what they're doing. And I'd like to see a future in which the companies don't treat teenagers as adults. So here in the US, we have a law that makes it effectively impossible to service any users under 13. And then once you're 13 years old, you're basically an adult, right? And that's just unrealistic, right? 13, 14, 15-year-olds are not able to properly navigate the online world, both in the interactions with others, but especially with interactions with adults. And I think my biggest piece of advice for parents is not to give kids phones too early, to give them a soft ramp up where kids have devices that have to stay in public parts of the house, where you are using the internet with them, you're watching YouTube with them, you're chatting with friends with them. That phones should be on your bedside at night, right? So your kids can't have phones in their room unsupervised at night. And that you build the expectation with your kids that they have no secrets from you on their devices. Because I do think probably actually the worst thing that happens online any day is the exploitation of children. We focus on all these other issues, but when it comes to kind of a sustained problem that has not gone away and only gets worse every year, the child exploitation issues are up there. And a part of that is just it's become socially required that you get your kid online way earlier than they're mentally ready for it.
So talk to kids.
Talk, and then build the expectation that you're going to be looking over their shoulder. I mean, it's sometimes it's hard to be the bad guy, right? But you should be checking their browser history. You should be looking through their Instagram feed. You should be looking at their text messages. Build the expectation that they don't have any secrecy from you. And if they have a device that they've changed the pin and you can't get into it, that thing goes away, right? Like, I think it's easy to give lots of kids devices and then to make them happy and quiet.
Yeah.
And then we've outsourced their training of how to use the internet to all of their friends. And the truth is especially teenagers are pretty horrible to each other, right? They're not good to each other online. And so being a resource to your kids in those situations. I think the other thing you have to do is make it clear to them that if they ever get in a situation that they feel entrapped by, that they can come talk to you, right? That's where things get really bad for kids, is when they make a mistake, like they send a naked photo and they're in trouble and they decide that I can't tell my parents because they'll be so angry. And so they continue to make mistakes that make things worse and worse, right? And building those open line communications are pretty critical.
You just mentioned that you and a group of your co-fellows are working on the paper to be released and recommendation to be released to US Congress as to what needs to be done on the national level to work more on the security over the internet. Like, what is that? Is it a new initiative or it's going to be a new center here at Stanford?
Yeah, so we have a new Stanford Cyber Policy Center that is bringing together people who have been working on these issues across Stanford for years. And then we have a new project under that I get to lead called the Stanford Internet Observatory. And that's going to be a cross-disciplinary team that builds the tools, techniques, and the training for us to understand the misuse of the internet to cause harm. And so we're focusing on things like misinformation during elections, but we're also going to look into these other issues of hate speech, child safety, online radicalization. Right now, it's very difficult for social scientists and political scientists to study these issues. So our hope is that if we build the technology once, it will make it easier to do good research in this area.
Oh, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Now, this short answer question.
Sure.
What is Ukraine in one sentence for you?
I see Ukraine as a bridge between East and West that also reflects a lot of the political issues that we're all dealing with now, several years in advance.
What are you reading right now?
I am reading a book called The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry.
Best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Best piece of business advice I've been given is when you go into any business meeting, have in your mind exactly what you want to get out of it before that.
Top 3 do's and don'ts for parents as to the kids' security and internet.
Don't give your kids privacy on their devices. Don't allow them to have them at night. Do build lines of communication that if your kids feel like they're in trouble, they feel they can come to you for help.
How much time daily you spend using social media?
I'm probably mostly on Twitter, maybe an hour or so a day.
And last question, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter?
I use Facebook to see my friends and family. I use Twitter to kind of communicate from a professional perspective. LinkedIn is my spam inbox.
Thank you.
Thank you.